Who would have thought that the small act of sharing a simple breakfast would change a struggling student's life forever? Maya thought she was just feeding a homeless stranger, but she never imagined that the madman in the park was actually a missing military legend waiting to be found. Maya lived her life in a perpetual state of exhaustion, moving through the world like a ghost haunting her own existence. She was a 22-year-old medical student with a brilliant mind, but her reality was defined by the 3 minimum-wage jobs she juggled just to keep the lights on in her cramped studio apartment in the worst part of the city. Her day began before the sun rose, a brutal cycle of textbooks, dirty dishes, and the smell of hospital antiseptic. But the truest testament to her struggle wasn't the dark circles bruised under her eyes. It was her shoes. They were cheap, white nurse's sneakers, grayed by years of wear, with a thick, ugly strip of silver duct tape binding the sole to the upper fabric. Every step she took was a squeaking reminder that she was one paycheck away from living on the street herself. Every morning, on her walk to the bus stop, Maya's taped shoe would pause at the entrance of the city park. There, on the same peeling green bench, sat Arthur. He was a fixture of the neighborhood, a mountain of discarded rags and matted gray beard that smelled of rain and neglect. To the rest of the world, Arthur was worse than invisible. He was a nuisance. Commuters in their pressed suits would cross the street to avoid him, wrinkling their noses at his odor. Mothers would yank their children's hands away, whispering harsh warnings about the madman who spent his days scratching nonsensical patterns into the dirt with a dry twig. Arthur was terrifying to them. He muttered to himself in a language no one understood, his eyes darting frantically as his hand carved jagged lines, spirals, and complex geometric shapes into the hard earth. People laughed at him. They called him crazy. They threw their trash near his bench, treating him like part of the garbage collection. But Maya didn't see a monster. She saw a mirror. One particularly freezing Tuesday, the wind was cutting through Maya's thin coat like a knife. She stopped at the bench, shivering. Her stomach growled, a violent protest against the hunger that had become her constant companion. In her hand, she clutched a brown paper bag containing a hot egg sandwich and a cup of black coffee. It had cost her $5.30, the absolute last of her money until her tips came in on Friday. The heat radiating from the bag was the only comfort she had. She looked at Arthur. He was shivering too, though he made no sound. He was barefoot. His feet, resting on the frozen concrete, were a map of pain, swollen, cracked, and bleeding slightly where the skin had split from the cold. Maya looked down at her own feet. She looked at the silver tape holding her sneaker together. Then she looked at his bleeding toes. The contrast broke her heart. She was poor, struggling to survive in a system designed to crush her, but she had shoes. She had a dream of becoming a doctor. He had nothing but a stick and the dirt. Ignoring the judgmental stare of a passing jogger, Maya walked over to the bench and sat down. The smell of unwashed clothes was overpowering, but she didn't flinch. She placed her paper bag between them. "It's cold today, Arthur," she said softly. It was the first time anyone had spoken to him in months without cursing. Arthur didn't look up. His hand kept moving, scratching a sharp angle into the dirt. Maya opened the bag. The aroma of melted cheese and brewing coffee rose into the air, a divine scent in the gray morning. She took out the sandwich. Her stomach clenched, begging for the food. She took a breath, broke the sandwich in half, and placed the larger piece on the bench next to his hand. Then, she poured half of her coffee into the paper cup's lid, careful not to spill a drop. "I made too much," she lied, her voice steady. "I can't finish it. You'd be doing me a favor." The scratching stopped. Slowly, painfully slowly, Arthur turned his head. His eyes were hidden beneath bushy gray eyebrows, but when they finally met hers, Maya gasped internally. They weren't the eyes of a madman. They were sharp, piercing, and startlingly blue. For a second, the fog of his existence seemed to clear, replaced by a look of profound confusion. He looked at the steaming sandwich, then at the girl with the taped shoes. He reached out with a trembling hand, his fingers stained with earth and grease. He didn't snatch the food like a starving animal. He took it with a strange, hesitant dignity. As his fingers brushed against the cuff of her worn uniform, a silent pact was sealed. In a city of millions, where everyone was running toward success, two people at the bottom of the world sat together on a freezing bench, sharing the warmth of a $5 breakfast. Maya didn't know it yet, but that half sandwich was the most important investment she would ever make. That single shared sandwich blossomed into a ritual that defied the logic of Maya's poverty. For the next 6 months, the rhythm of her life was set to the beat of this silent friendship. It didn't matter if the sky was dumping freezing rain that turned the city into a gray slush, or if the summer heat was radiating off the asphalt in shimmering waves. Maya was there. She became an expert at stretching her meager budget. Sometimes it was a leftover bagel from the diner where she worked the night shift. Sometimes it was oatmeal she made in her tiny kitchenette, carried in a plastic container. But she never came empty-handed. To an outsider, their interactions were painfully sparse. There were no long conversations about the weather or politics. There were no exchanged life stories. Maya would sit, place the food on the bench, and open her medical textbooks. Arthur would eat with a focused, almost desperate intensity, wiping every crumb from his beard. When he was finished, he would offer a single, sharp nod, a gesture that felt like a thank you and more like a soldier acknowledging a delivered supply drop. But while the rest of the world saw a dirty old man wasting space, Maya began to see something else. As a medical student, her brain was wired to look for patterns, to diagnose symptoms, to see what lay beneath the surface. And what she saw beneath Arthur's madness was startling. One morning, while memorizing the anatomy of the nervous system, Maya watched Arthur pick up his stick. Usually, she tuned out his scratching as background noise, but today the sunlight hit the patch of dirt he was working on at just the right angle. He wasn't drawing scribbles. He wasn't drawing random circles or chaotic lines like a child. Maya squinted, leaning closer. The lines were precise. He had drawn a complex series of intersecting arcs, bisected by straight, rigid vectors. Next to the arcs were clusters of symbols. They looked like numbers, but written in a shorthand she didn't recognize. "Is that calculus?" Maya whispered, half to herself. Arthur didn't answer. He just tapped the stick against a specific point on the curve, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. He drew a jagged line representing a horizon, a mountain range, perhaps, and then calculated a trajectory over it. It looked like a topographical map overlaid with physics equations. It looked like the flight path of something moving very, very fast. Maya sat back, stunned. She looked at the man eating her oatmeal. His fingernails were black with grime, his coat was held together with safety pins, but the mind guiding that stick possessed a terrifying precision. However, Maya was alone in her observation. To everyone else in her life, Arthur was a parasite. "You're losing it, Maya," her friend Sarah snapped one afternoon as they walked past the park. Sarah pointed a manicured nail at the bench where Arthur was sleeping. "You are literally burning money. You're 3 weeks late on your portion of the electric bill, but you're running a soup kitchen for a junkie?" "He's not a junkie, Sarah," Maya defended, her voice low. "He's hungry." "He's a bum!" Sarah laughed, cruel and dismissive. "Look at him. He's probably drawing fairies in the dirt. You're feeding the beast, Maya. You think he cares about you? If you stopped bringing food tomorrow, he wouldn't even remember your name. You're nurturing a dead end." The words stung because they touched on Maya's own deepest fears. Was she being naive? Was she projecting dignity onto a man who had lost his mind years ago? But then, she would look back at the bench. She would see Arthur pause in his eating to watch a plane fly overhead. She would see his eyes track the aircraft, not with the wonder of a child, but with the critical, narrowing gaze of a predator assessing a target. For a fleeting second, the fog of age and poverty would vanish, and his eyes would burn with a fierce, cold intelligence. It was a look of authority, a look of command. Maya ignored Sarah. She ignored the sneers of the passers-by who crossed the street to avoid them. She trusted that spark in Arthur's blue eyes more than she trusted the judgments of the world. She didn't know what he was calculating in the dirt, but she knew that inside the shell of the madman lived a soul that was still fighting to solve a problem only he could see. and as long as he was fighting, she would make sure he had the strength to hold the stick. The letter didn't feel heavy in her hand, but it crushed Maya as effectively as a falling boulder. Standing outside the dean's office, the hum of the medical school hallway seemed to fade into a dull, underwater roar. The words on the cream-colored stationery were polite, professional, and absolutely lethal. Administrative dismissal due to outstanding financial obligations. "We're sorry, Maya," the bursar had said, not looking up from her computer. "But the grace period ended yesterday. You can reapply once the debt is cleared." Clear the debt? It was $40,000. It might as well have been 40 million. Maya walked out of the building in a daze, stripping off her white lab coat, the uniform she had worked her entire life to wear, and stuffing it into her backpack. She felt like an imposter, a failure, but the universe wasn't finished with her yet. When she trudged up the stairs to her apartment building, dread pooling in her stomach, she saw it. A neon orange sticker plastered to her door. Eviction notice. Her landlord, Mr. Henderson, was waiting in the hallway, arms crossed over his chest. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered a deadline. "I want you out by tomorrow noon, Maya. I have a paying tenant ready to move in. Don't make me call the sheriff." Maya didn't argue. She didn't beg. The fight had simply evaporated from her body. She went inside, packed the few clothes she owned, and looked at the empty refrigerator. There was one sandwich left, a ham and cheese on stale rye bread. She walked to the park. It was late afternoon, the sun dipping below the skyline, casting long, melancholy shadows across the grass. Arthur was there, as always, staring intently at a patch of dirt. Maya sat down heavily beside him. She didn't open her book. She didn't check her watch. She just sat there, and for the first time in her life, she let the dam break. It started as a sniffle, then a tremble, and finally a gut-wrenching sob that shook her entire small frame. She buried her face in her hands, the shame of her poverty burning her skin. Arthur stopped scratching the dirt. He sat motionless, listening to the sound of her world collapsing. After a long time, Maya wiped her face with her sleeve. Her eyes were red and swollen. She reached into her bag and pulled out the sandwich. She held it out to him, her hand shaking. "Here," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Take it, Arthur." He looked at the food, then at her. He didn't take it immediately. "It's ham!" Maya choked out, a fresh tear sliding down her cheek. And it's the last one. I can't come tomorrow. I can't come anymore." She looked at the ground, unable to meet his gaze. "I got kicked out of school. I'm getting kicked out of my apartment. Tomorrow, I'll be sleeping on a bench just like this one. I failed, Arthur. I tried so hard, but I lost everything." Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Maya expected him to grunt, grab the sandwich, and ignore her misery as he always did. She expected the madman to stay in his own world. "Negative." The word cut through the air like a gunshot. Maya froze. She looked up. Arthur wasn't hunched over. He was sitting spine straight, his shoulders squared. The tremor in his hands was gone. He wasn't looking at the sandwich. He was looking directly at her, and the fog in his blue eyes had completely vanished. In its place was a terrifying clarity, a steel-hard intensity that made him look 20 years younger. "I beg your pardon?" Maya stammered, stunned by the sudden change in his demeanor. "You have not lost everything," Arthur said. His voice didn't sound like the raspy mumble of a homeless man. It was deep, resonant, and commanded absolute attention. It was the voice of a man who was used to being obeyed by thousands. "And you are not homeless, Maya. You are simply in a phase of strategic reconstruction." He reached into the pocket of his filthy coat and pulled out a crumpled, grease-stained napkin and a nub of a pencil. He placed the napkin on his knee and wrote something down. His movements were sharp and precise, no wasted energy. He handed the napkin to her. "Take this," he ordered. Maya took it, bewildered. Scrawled on the paper in jagged, blocky handwriting was not a phone number and not a plea for money. It was a string of alphanumerics. ARCHI01 ACT KEY 772. What is this?" Maya asked, looking at the nonsense code. That is your contingency plan, Arthur said, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made her shiver. Keep it safe. Do not lose it. When the time is right, it will open the door. Then, just as quickly as the clarity had come, it seemed to fade. Arthur slumped back down, his shoulders rounding, the tremor returning to his hands. He snatched the sandwich from her lap and took a massive bite, muttering something unintelligible about the wind direction. Maya sat there, holding the greasy napkin, staring at the man who had just transformed before her eyes and then vanished back into his shell. She didn't know if he was crazy or brilliant, but for the first time that day, the crushing weight in her chest felt just a fraction lighter. She put the napkin in her pocket, not knowing she was carrying the key to a kingdom. The next morning, the sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the threat of a storm. Maya walked to the park, her steps heavy. She wasn't going to school. She wasn't going to work. She was going to say goodbye. She had packed her life into 2 suitcases that were currently sitting by the door of her apartment, waiting for the inevitable eviction at noon. But before she left the neighborhood forever, she needed to see Arthur one last time. She wanted to make sure he had enough food for the day, maybe give him her thick wool scarf since she would be heading to a shelter where it was warm. But as she rounded the corner, her heart sank. The bench was empty. It wasn't just empty, it was sanitized. The pile of rags Arthur usually sat on was gone. The collection of twigs and dry leaves he used for his calculations had been swept away. Even the dirt in front of the bench, usually scarred with his complex geometrical etchings, had been smoothed over, as if a giant hand had wiped the slate clean. Maya stood there, blinking, a strange panic rising in her chest. Arthur was always here. He was as permanent as the oak trees. "Hey!" she called out to a man walking his dog nearby. "Excuse me, have you seen the old man? The one who sits here?" The man stopped, looking at the empty bench with wide eyes. "You didn't hear?" he whispered, glancing around nervously. "It was the craziest thing I've ever seen. Happened about 3 a.m. "What happened?" Maya asked, gripping the strap of her bag. "Did the police take him? Did he get sick?" "Police?" The man laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "Lady, it wasn't the police. It was a bird. A massive black helicopter, no lights, no markings. It came down right there on the soccer field." The man pointed to the open grass area 100 yards away. "The wind from the rotors nearly blew my windows out." Maya stared at him, unable to process the words. "A helicopter? For a homeless man?" "That's what I said," the man continued, clearly still shaken. 4 guys jumped out, not cops. They looked like SWAT, maybe? Or military. They were wearing those night vision goggles. They ran straight to this bench. I thought they were going to arrest him, but—" He paused, shaking his head. "But what?" Maya pressed. "They bowed," the man said, his voice hushed. "I swear on my mother's life. One of them knelt down and bowed to the old guy. Then they helped him up, walked him to the chopper, and whoosh, gone in 60 seconds, like he never existed." Maya stood frozen on the sidewalk. The wind whipped her hair across her face, stinging her eyes. It sounded impossible. It sounded like a fever dream. Arthur? The man who ate her leftover oatmeal? The man who wore plastic bags on his feet when it rained? She reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled napkin he had given her yesterday. The grease stain had spread, making the paper translucent. "Strategic reconstruction," he had said. But standing there in the cold light of day, with eviction looming over her head and her stomach empty, the magic of yesterday's moment evaporated. The man with the dog was probably drunk or exaggerating. It was probably just social services or the police doing a sweep of the park. And the helicopter was just a story to make a sad event sound exciting. Arthur was gone, taken to a shelter, or a psych ward, or jail. He was gone, just like her parents, just like her career, just like her home. A wave of bitterness washed over her. She had been foolish. She had spent months feeding a delusion, hoping for a connection, and now she was left with nothing but a piece of trash. "Just a crazy old man," she whispered to herself, her voice thick with disappointment. "And a crazy, stupid girl." She looked at the napkin one last time. It wasn't a key, it wasn't a contingency plan, it was just scribbles from a mind broken by the world. given to a girl who was about to be broken too. With a sudden burst of anger, Maya balled the napkin up in her fist. She walked to the metal trash can bolted to the sidewalk and threw it in with force. "Goodbye, Arthur," she muttered, turning her back on the empty bench. She walked away, head down, shoulders hunched against the wind, trudging back to her apartment to face the landlord and the end of her life as she knew it. She didn't look back at the trash can. She didn't know that the wadded-up piece of paper sitting on top of a pile of coffee cups was worth more than the entire city block she was walking on. The deadline for Maya's eviction was 12 p.m. At 11:55 a.m., she sat on her suitcase in the center of her empty living room, staring at the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light. She was waiting for Mr. Henderson to come pounding on the door to throw her out. She expected shouting. She expected the humiliating screech of dragging furniture. What she didn't expect was the earthquake. It started as a low vibration in the floorboards, rattling the empty coffee mug on the counter. Then came the sound, a deep, guttural, mechanical roar that grew louder and louder until it swallowed the noise of the city traffic entirely. It sounded like a war zone. Maya rushed to the window and pulled back the cracked blinds. Her breath hitched in her throat. The street below, usually filled with delivery trucks and potholes, had been transformed into a fortress. Local police cruisers were parked sideways at both ends of the block, their lights flashing, creating a hard perimeter. Behind them, keeping the curious crowd of neighbors at bay, stood officers with megaphones shouting, "Clear the area! Step back!" But it was what was parked directly in front of her building that made Maya's blood run cold. 3 massive, matte black military Humvees idled at the curb. They looked like beasts from another world, their armored plating absorbing the sunlight. Soldiers in full tactical gear, helmets, vests, rifles strapped to their chests, were pouring out of the vehicles. They moved with terrifying precision, securing the entrance to her building in seconds. "Oh my God," Maya whispered, backing away from the window. "What is happening?" Before she could process the scene, a fist hammered against her door. It wasn't the rhythmic knock of a visitor, it was the frantic pounding of panic. "Maya, open this door right now!" It was Mr. Henderson. Maya unlocked the deadbolt with trembling fingers. The door flew open, and her landlord practically fell into the room. He was a large man, usually red-faced with arrogance, but now he was pale and sweating profusely. "What did you do?" he screamed, spraying spit. He grabbed her arm, his grip painful. "You didn't tell me you were a criminal! You didn't tell me you were wanted by the feds!" I'm not," Maya stammered, pulling away. "I haven't done anything." "Then why is the entire U.S. Army downstairs?" Henderson yelled, his voice cracking with fear. "They're coming up here! For you! I'm not going to jail for harboring a fugitive! I'm an honest man!" From the stairwell, the sound of heavy boots echoed. Thud, thud, thud. Getting closer, louder, faster. It was the sound of overwhelming force. Henderson threw his hands up, backing away from Maya as if she were radioactive. "I'm evicting her!" he shouted at the open doorway, addressing the unseen soldiers. "She doesn't live here anymore! I don't know her!" 2 soldiers appeared in the doorway first. They were giants, their faces obscured by dark visors. They swept the room with their rifles, the red laser sights dancing across the peeling wallpaper and landing briefly on Maya's chest. Maya squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the shout of, "Get down!" or the cold metal of handcuffs. She thought about the unpaid tuition. Had they criminalized debt? Was this a mistake? "Secure!" one soldier barked. The soldiers stepped aside, creating a corridor. A silence fell over the hallway. Even Henderson stopped hyperventilating. Into the room walked a man who radiated an aura of absolute authority. He was older, with silver hair cut close to the scalp and a jawline that looked carved from granite. He wore a dress uniform decorated with so many ribbons and medals that his chest seemed to be made of gold. On his shoulder, 4 silver stars caught the light. He stepped over the threshold, his polished boots gleaming against the dirty linoleum. He didn't look at the screaming landlord. He didn't look at the mold in the corners. His steel-gray eyes locked instantly onto Maya. Henderson, realizing he was in the presence of a general, started babbling again. "Sir, officer, general, whatever you are, this girl is trash. She hasn't paid rent in 3 months. Take her. Just don't destroy my property." The general turned his head slowly. He looked at Henderson with an expression of such withering disdain that the landlord's mouth snapped shut audibly. "One more word," the general said, his voice quiet but terrifyingly calm, "and I will have this building condemned and leveled by airstrike before lunch. Do I make myself clear?" Henderson nodded frantically, backing himself into a corner, trembling. The general turned back to Maya. He walked toward her. Maya shrank back against the kitchen sink, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Maya Williams?" the general asked. Yes," she whispered, bracing for the arrest. "I'm sorry, I don't have the money. I'll leave, I promise." The general stopped 2 feet in front of her. He looked at her worn-out waitress uniform. He looked at the duct tape on her shoes. His expression softened, the hard lines of his face relaxing into something that looked almost like awe. He didn't reach for his sidearm. He didn't pull out handcuffs. Slowly, deliberately, the 4-star general straightened his spine. He snapped his heels together. He raised his right hand to the brim of his cap, and he saluted her. It wasn't a casual wave. It was a crisp, formal, lingering salute, the kind given to a head of state or a fallen hero. "Miss Williams," the general said, lowering his hand but keeping his posture rigid. "You are not under arrest. My name is General Sterling, and I am here on behalf of the Department of Defense to thank you." The room spun. Maya gripped the counter to keep from falling. "Thank me? For what?" General Sterling reached into his pocket, but instead of a weapon, he pulled out a familiar, grease-stained object. It was a dirty plastic Tupperware container, the one Maya had used to bring oatmeal to the park 2 days ago. "For keeping the architect alive," the general said softly. "When the world threw him away, you were the only supply line he had." Maya stared at the plastic container in the general's hand, her mind racing to connect the dots. The madman in the park, the military convoy, the salute. It felt like pieces of 2 different puzzles being jammed together. "Arthur?" she whispered, the name feeling small in the presence of such power. "You're talking about Arthur? The homeless man?" General Sterling shook his head slowly. "To you, he was Arthur. To the rest of the world, he is Dr. Arthur Pendleton. But inside the Pentagon, we just call him the architect." The general gestured to the soldiers, who immediately stepped outside, closing the apartment door to give them privacy. Even Mr. Henderson, pale and silent, was ushered out, leaving Maya alone with the general in her empty living room. "Dr. Pendleton is not just a strategist, Maya," Sterling began, pacing the small room. "He is the single greatest military mind of the last century. He designed the Iron Dome derivatives. He wrote the algorithms that encrypt our nuclear codes. The security of this entire nation rests on systems that exist only in his head." "But he was eating out of garbage cans," Maya protested, the image of Arthur shivering on the bench flashing in her mind. "He had plastic bags on his feet." 18 months ago, he vanished," Sterling explained, his voice heavy with regret. "His wife passed away, and the grief triggered a severe episode of early-onset dementia, compounded by PTSD from his years in service. He didn't defect, he didn't run, he just broke. He walked out of his secure facility in D.C. and disappeared into the streets. We have spent millions trying to find him. Satellites, facial recognition, field agents, we looked everywhere." The general paused, looking at Maya with intense respect. "Everywhere except the one place he chose to hide. In plain sight, disguised by the invisibility of poverty." Maya thought back to the mornings in the park, the way people walked past Arthur without even glancing at him. He had been invisible to them because they chose not to see him. "But how did you find him?" Maya asked. "We didn't," Sterling corrected. "He found us, or rather he decided to come back, and that is because of you." The general pulled a tablet from his jacket. He tapped the screen and turned it toward Maya. It displayed a high-resolution aerial photograph of the park. It was zoomed in on the dirt patch in front of Arthur's bench. "Do you recognize this?" Sterling asked. Maya looked. The scratches in the dirt, the arcs, the vectors. "He was drawing pictures," she said. No, Sterling said firmly. He was coding. Look closely. He swiped to the next image. It was a digital overlay, matching the dirt scratches to a complex 3D blueprint. For the last year, our national defense grid has had a critical vulnerability, a flaw in the satellite tracking logic. Our entire team of engineers couldn't fix it. We were blind. Sterling pointed to the dirt markings on the screen. Those pictures you saw him drawing? That was the patch. He was solving the unsolvable problem using a stick and mud. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She remembered the morning she saw him calculating the trajectory. She remembered the intense focus in his blue eyes. He told us everything during the debriefing this morning, Sterling continued, his voice softening. He said his mind was lost in the fog. He didn't know who he was or where he was. But every morning, a girl came. She brought food. She sat with him. She didn't ask for anything, she just offered kindness. The general looked Maya in the eye. He said the food kept his body alive, but your consistency, your presence, it anchored his mind. It gave him a routine. And slowly, through that routine, the fog lifted. He started to remember the math. He started to remember the mission. You didn't just feed a homeless man, Maya. You nursed a genius back to sanity. Maya felt tears pricking her eyes. She thought of the half sandwiches, the cold coffee, the way she had worried about him being lonely. She had never thought she was saving anyone. She was just trying to be a friend. He remembers everything now, Sterling said, including what happened yesterday. He told us about your situation. He told us you were being evicted. The general reached into his pocket again. This time he didn't pull out a plastic container. He pulled out a crumpled, grease-stained napkin. Maya gasped. It was the napkin she had thrown in the trash, the one with the nonsense code. You threw this away, Sterling noted with a small smile. Fortunately, our recovery team is very thorough. Do you know what this is? Maya shook her head. He said it was a contingency plan. It is, Sterling said. It's an authorization code, level 5 clearance. It overrides the Department of Defense budget allocation protocols. He handed the napkin back to her, smoothing it out on the counter. Arthur wrote this for you because he knew you were in trouble. He tried to give you the only thing he had left to give, his authority. So, Maya whispered, her voice trembling, it wasn't a lottery number. No, Sterling laughed softly. It was a command, a direct order from the architect to the United States military to fix your life, the same way you fixed his mind. General Sterling reached into the breast pocket of his decorated uniform and withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope. It wasn't a standard government issue. It was heavy, textured paper, sealed with the official crimson wax stamp of the Department of Defense. The United States military pays its debts, Maya, Sterling said, his voice solemn, and Dr. Pendleton made it very clear that his debt to you is the priority of national security. He extended the envelope. Maya took it, her hands trembling so violently she nearly dropped it. The paper felt warm, as if it still carried the energy of the man who had sent it. Go ahead, Sterling urged gently. Open it. Maya broke the seal. Inside there was no check, no stack of cash. Instead, there were 3 documents bound in blue legal folders. She pulled out the first one. Certificate of Full Scholarship, United States Army Medical Corps. That authorizes a full-ride scholarship to any medical school of your choice, Sterling explained as Maya stared at the words, her breath catching in her throat. Tuition, books, lab fees, and a monthly living stipend equivalent to a captain's salary. You will never have to work a night shift again, Maya. Your only job now is to become the doctor you were born to be. Tears welled up in Maya's eyes, blurring the ink. $40,000 of debt wiped away in a second. The crushing weight that had been suffocating her for years simply vanished. And the second document, Sterling pointed. Maya turned the page. It was a property deed. Title of ownership. It's a townhome, Sterling said. 3 blocks from the university campus. Fully furnished. Utilities paid for the next 5 years. It has a study, a stocked kitchen, and... He paused, a small smile touching his lips. A very comfortable porch, should you ever wish to sit outside and drink coffee. Maya covered her mouth with her hand, a sob escaping her throat. I, I don't understand. This is too much. I just gave him a sandwich. I just listened to him. You gave him dignity, Sterling corrected firmly. But there is one more thing. The third item. Maya reached into the envelope one last time. Her fingers brushed against a piece of folded notebook paper. It wasn't official stationery. It was torn from a spiral-bound notebook, the same kind of cheap paper she used for her classes. She unfolded it. The handwriting was jagged, sharp, and unmistakable. My dear Maya, if you are reading this, then General Sterling has successfully executed my final strategic maneuver. I apologize for the dramatic entrance. Subtlety was never the Army's strong suit. For 6 months, you sat beside a ghost. You saw a man covered in the filth of his own mind, rejected by a world that once celebrated him. You had every reason to walk away. You had every reason to save your $5 for yourself. But you didn't. You thanked me for eating. You apologized for making too much coffee. You treated a madman with the reverence usually reserved for kings. You saved me from the starvation of the stomach, yes. But more importantly, Maya, you saved me from the starvation of the soul. You reminded me that in a chaotic universe, the variable of human kindness is the only constant that matters. I know you threw the napkin away. You are a scientist. You rely on data, not hope. You thought it was the scribbling of a fool. But that code, Arch-01, was not a lottery ticket. It was the activation key for the Pendleton Grant, a dormant fund I established years ago for minds that have the brilliance to change the world, but lack the resources to enter the room. I knew you would discard it. That is why I sent the cavalry. Consider this my tuition payment for the 6 months of breakfast you provided. It is a small price to pay for the return of my sanity. Study hard, Dr. Williams. The world is sick, and it needs your hands to heal it. Yours in strategy and gratitude, the architect. Maya lowered the letter. The tears were flowing freely now, hot and cleansing. She looked around her empty, crumbling apartment, the place she was supposed to be evicted from in 5 minutes. It didn't look like a prison anymore. It looked like a cocoon she was finally breaking free from. General Sterling watched her, his expression softening. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. The car is downstairs, Maya, he said. Your new home is ready. Your boxes will be moved by my team within the hour. Maya wiped her face, clutching the letter to her chest like a shield. She looked at the general, then at the spot on the floor where she had sat crying yesterday, thinking her life was over. Thank you, she whispered, her voice steadying. Don't thank me, Sterling said, turning toward the door. Thank the man who ran the numbers. He calculated the probability of your success to be 99.9%, and Arthur Pendleton never miscalculates. Maya took a deep breath. She grabbed her backpack, the one with the duct tape on the strap. She didn't need it anymore, but she wouldn't leave it behind. It was a reminder. She walked to the door, stepping past the stunned Mr. Henderson, who was still cowering in the hallway. She walked out into the sunlight, not as a victim, and not just as a survivor. She walked out as the architect's chosen successor. 5 years is a long time in the life of a soldier, but it is an eternity in the life of a dream. The seasons turned, the snow melted and returned, and the girl who once taped her shoes together was gone. In her place stood Captain Maya Williams of the United States Army Medical Corps. Her uniform was pressed to a razor's edge, her boots were polished to a mirror shine, and the stethoscope around her neck was no longer a prop for a student, but the tool of a healer. It was a crisp Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that smelled of rain and memories, when Maya parked her car in front of the Pendleton Center for Cognitive Recovery. It was a state-of-the-art facility nestled in the rolling hills of Virginia, a sanctuary built with the very funds Arthur had unlocked for the military all those years ago. It was a palace of glass and stone, designed to protect the minds of those who had given everything for their country. Maya walked through the automatic doors, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. The nurses at the station looked up and smiled, saluting her informally. They knew who she was. Everyone here knew the story of the girl and the architect. He's in the solarium, Captain, the head nurse said softly. He's having a good day. He was asking about the trajectory of the sun earlier. Maya smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. Thank you. She walked down the quiet hallway, clutching a brown paper bag in her hand. It wasn't the grease-stained bag from the corner bodega anymore. It was clean, crisp, and warm. Inside was an egg sandwich on rye, cut in half, and a cup of black coffee. Some rituals were too sacred to change. She found him sitting by a massive floor-to-ceiling window, overlooking a garden filled with blooming hydrangeas. Arthur Pendleton looked different now. The matted gray beard was trimmed into a neat, distinguished goatee. His rags had been replaced by a soft cashmere cardigan and comfortable trousers. He was clean. He was safe. But he was also undeniably older. Time had finally caught up with the architect. He sat in a wheelchair, a blanket draped over his knees, watching the clouds drift by with that same intense, calculating stare she remembered from the park. Maya stepped into the room. She didn't announce herself. She didn't salute. She simply walked over and sat on the ottoman beside his chair, just as she used to sit on the bench. "Report for duty, sir," she whispered. Arthur didn't jump. He turned his head slowly. The blue eyes were softer now, the fierce steel tempered by age and peace. He looked at her uniform. He looked at the captain's bars on her collar. A flicker of recognition sparked in his gaze, not the recognition of a general seeing a soldier, but of a friend seeing a lifeline. "Captain," Arthur rasped, his voice thin but steady. "You're late." Maya laughed, the sound bubbling up from her soul. "Traffic on the I-95, sir. Strategic delay." She placed the paper bag on the small table between them. The smell of the coffee drifted through the air, cutting through the sterile scent of the hospital. It was the smell of the street corner, the smell of survival. Arthur looked at the bag. His hand, shaking slightly with a tremor that never fully went away, reached out. He didn't open it immediately. He just rested his hand on the warm paper, closing his eyes as if absorbing the heat. "Egg?" he asked. "And extra cheese," Maya confirmed. "Just how you like it." Arthur opened his eyes. He looked at Maya, really looked at her. He saw the woman she had become, strong, capable, saved. And in her reflection, he saw his own redemption. He saw the legacy he had almost thrown away in a trash can now sitting beside him, saving lives because he had saved her. He didn't say a profound equation. He didn't offer a strategic analysis of the geopolitical climate. He simply smiled. It was a gummy, lopsided, toothless smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and lit up the room brighter than the sun outside. "Good," Arthur whispered, unwrapping the sandwich with trembling reverence. "We have fuel. Now, tell me about the hospital. Are the interns still making calculation errors?" Maya leaned in, taking his hand. "Let me tell you everything, Arthur." As the camera pulls back, leaving the two of them framed against the window, the young doctor and the old master, sharing a meal in the quiet luxury of a peace they both fought for, the image fades to black, leaving only their silhouettes. Kindness is a strange currency. It is the only investment in the world that never loses value. It is a language that the deaf can hear and the blind can see. We walk through life with our heads down, ignoring the madmen on the benches, the people in the shadows, the ones who look like they have nothing to offer. But Maya Williams stopped. She looked, and she served. You never know if the hand you hold belongs to a beggar or a king. You never know if you are serving a broken soul or a guardian angel in disguise. But the truth is, it doesn't matter. Because when you serve with your whole heart, you don't just save them, you save yourself. And sometimes, just sometimes, a simple breakfast can feed a nation.